All right, go for it.
Okay, my name is Adrian. I work at Google, and as I think a lot of you know, Yusui is stepping away from this work because he is moving to another team. And I've been talking to him and David Oppenheimer about stepping in. So I'll be looking at doing some work in this area over the next couple of months. I've been just starting to figure out what I want to work on, but it will probably be closely related to the tenancy controller. And yeah, I want to start exploring some of the alternatives that he spoke about and seeing if any of them will work. So yeah, that's it. I've been at Google for about 3 years now, and on Kubernetes since October.
Great. Any other newcomers that want to introduce themselves?
Yeah, this is Chris Petrelli. I'm an engineer at Twitter, and I'm working on our Kubernetes migration.
Awesome, welcome. And you guys, well, I assume you guys are cloud-based or Kubernetes on-prem?
We were doing both. So both GKE and on-prem on bare metal, which is as exciting as you might imagine.
I'm Kubernetes bare metal as well.
Then we should definitely talk.
Exciting is one word. Miserable is another.
Well, I mean, it's not new for us. I mean, we've been running Mesos and Aurora on 6 figures worth of servers for close to a decade. So it's not quite as bad, but it comes with some interesting challenges.
Right. Cool. Anyone else?
Hey, I'm Chris Gordon. Just really, this is my first call as well. I'm here more lurking and just trying to absorb and learn. At my company, Acquia, we are cloud-based and also starting to move into the realm of EKS on Amazon. So just trying to learn more about hard multi-tenancy in general, how to secure that. So hanging out here.
Cool. Tasha, did you have anything else you wanted to say? I think you have to drop.
No, not really. I just started a new project board that we can add tasks to. I know people were asking in the Kubernetes Slack channel if we could, as a result of this meeting, like add some tasks there that people can pick up and run with between meetings. So I think that's a great place to do it. If you need any help with that, I can, let me know. But yeah, I think we're good to go. Also, we should probably create a new repo for the V2 stuff. I had someone ping me saying they were going to open a PR for that, but I didn't see a PR come through. So if anyone wants to kick that off, whenever we're ready, we can do that. And yeah, I think that's it.
Cool.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to drop. So ping me if you need me for anything.
Will do. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Okay. So I guess we will do this. I will, I guess, share my screen and be the designated typer. Or people are already doing it anyway. So I'll share my screen so people can see it if they can't, and then we can go from there. And so, yeah, so I think we'll just want to kind of dump down to a brain dump of things that people liked and didn't like with V2 or V1, and just kind of a discussion and kind of start breaking up some tasks. And then I guess Tasha and I can go in and add those to GitHub later. And then people can start choosing or assigning to themselves.
Is there any one thing that's motivating the switch to V2 as opposed to just an evolution of V1, or was it just the idea that, oh, that was just a proof of concept, now we want to do it for real?
Yeah, I mean, V1 is really POC, and I think that, there's nothing to say we can't reuse a lot of V1. I think part of the push to V2 was also because EC was stepping away. We didn't have someone else who, wrote all the code around. So that was, I think, part of it as well. And then I know Tom is, I think, here too. He's been working on, he did, I think, a production one for a client, and he's working on an open source version as well. So I think we just have a lot more people around that have done something similar.
Yeah, the production one was OpenShift focused, so this new one will be more Kubernetes focused.
Awesome. Cool. Does so I guess discussions. I know Adrian, you said you had some things you wanted to discuss. This is, I guess, open. So Tasha and Sanjeev are both the leads here, so we're without our lead, so we can be as wild as we want.
Yeah, sadly, I didn't get a chance to talk to Sanjeev before he left on vacation because I only agreed to join this at the beginning of last week. Yeah, there were a couple of things that I noticed about the tenant CRD, and I spoke about this with Yisui briefly. One is that it seems quite monolithic, and I think that there are people, like there's some discussions here about like tenant versus tenant namespace. But I think I'd even go maybe a step further than that. And when I look at tenant namespace, I asked this question on the Slack channel last night, which was there are lots of, it seems like the purpose of having a tenant namespace is to have a way to set up a namespace, pre-populate it with a bunch of objects, typically policy objects. But there's a bunch of people out there who are already trying to do this in different ways. It doesn't seem like it's necessarily a concept that's tied to tenancy. And so I'm wondering, is there some kind of other project for templating or auto-populating namespaces or sets of objects, even like in the extreme version, it could be like a mini version of Helm or something like that. Is there something else that we could make use of instead of building it ourselves? And so make this a composable solution on top of other standards, or help drive those if they don't exist. That's one question. The other question I had was that it seems like we're not just defining a bunch of features, we're defining a new concept in the Kubernetes ecosystem, which is called tenant. And I'm a little bit wary of defining whole new concepts like that. And I was wondering what happened, and Yisui had this as a proposal somewhere as well, which is hierarchical namespaces. And he thought that was infeasible, but I kind of liked the idea, and I wanted to explore that with a controller kind of implementation of basically allowing different namespaces to point to each other as parents and automatically copying objects through that. This is kind of based on a Google specific product called Anthos Config Management. I don't know if anyone's looked into it, but it's a similar kind of idea where you set up a hierarchy of namespaces, then objects like RBAC objects get copied. And so that avoids adding this new top level concept called tenant, because you're still just based on namespaces. It's more adding a feature to an existing primitive. So those were kind of the two ideas I wanted to explore.
Yeah, and so that second thing that you were discussing with the kind of the hierarchical namespaces, it kind of it seems like the Federation V2 stuff is doing something similar to that, but mostly focused across cluster.
Yeah, so this would all be within a single cluster.
Right.
What are they doing across clusters?
So my understanding, I read the initial proposal and I haven't really checked back in a couple of months. But my takeaway was that you could have kind of a master or driver cluster that you could have one or more or all namespaces synced across multiple clusters. So you could set RBAC and all that, and they would kind of propagate out. That's my understanding of what they were shooting for. I know they've made a lot of progress since then, so I don't know what has changed from design.
It's kind of funny because that's another thing that Anthos Config Management does. It's orthogonal. It's related with orthogonal. So that one, you're basically stamping out namespaces, whereas I'm talking about making a tree of namespaces. And
right.
In both cases, things are being copied around. But yeah, they're certainly related, and it might be worth keeping an eye on it. But that's another good reason to maybe stick to an established construct like namespaces, as opposed, and be careful about adding a new concept called tenant, because for example, KubeFed or Federation already works based off of namespaces. We wouldn't want to have to go back and try to rejig it to work with tenancy as well. But if we just want to say, oh, you're already syncing namespaces, just make sure this one other annotation is synced along with it, and everything will just work on all of your clusters and not just one.
Right. Yeah. And so I think the big issue that we've kind of discussed in the past is, it's changing some core things with Kubernetes, right? So hierarchical namespaces in general, right? So we've talked to some of the API machinery and other folks in SIG architecture about this, and a lot of it is more so a question of whether or not the work is worth the reward for some of this.
I want to do it in I want to do it entirely in controllers, entirely outside of core Kubernetes.
Okay, so I mean the issue with that though then is right handling RBAC between the hierarchical namespaces. You have to basically re-implement RBAC yourself, right?
I don't believe that that's the case. So that's why the method would be to copy the RBAC objects. That would be the job of the controller, the hierarchical controller, is that it would have lists of certain kinds of objects that get copied from parents to children. So examples might be RBAC objects, quota objects, secrets would be another useful one. And so if one of those objects appeared in a parent namespace, it would automatically be copied to the child, which would of course have in the case of RBAC, would have the effect of anybody who has any permissions in a parent namespace would automatically get those permissions in the child as well, as soon as the object is synced.
Okay, and so then the other common, I guess, gotcha for a lot of these things from a tenant perspective, and not so much for this, but cluster roles and cluster role bindings too are kind of heavily tied to like namespacing, right? So
right.
And it's always you can get all or you can get none, and that's what your choice is. But I guess, but more specifically, right? So you generally have to specify. So you can't really copy down a cluster role bind. You basically have to edit it to add namespaces if you're going to add it to the parent and then copy it down. So then yeah. So I totally get it, and this is I think something that we've kind of gone down internally as well. But after a while, it does seem like you're re-implementing a lot of things that should already exist. Anyone else have feedback or anything, I guess, along those lines that they want to discuss?
So this is Chris. I think one of the things I've struggled with as I've trying to go up to speed with the background of the multi-tenancy effort is sort of what are the guarantees we're trying to provide people, right? I mean, there's a certain upper bound to what various container technologies can provide, and different ones give you different potential isolation models. But I'm curious, like, what is the exact problem we're trying to solve?
So, I mean, I think that's been a from like a historical perspective, a huge issue with this working group is because everyone is here for a different reason. So I'm selfishly here because we're bare metal and we have to be bare metal. And we can't really spin up multiple Kubernetes clusters without charging our customers an extra couple $100,000. So for us, it's more so improving our product, and so getting improving multi-tenancy within a single Kubernetes cluster greatly allows us to handle the workloads that we have. I know other people are more cloud-based, and so that's less of a concern. So we really have run the gambit, and we've had lots of discussions between soft multi-tenancy, hard multi-tenancy, et cetera, and so the goal of the Tenancy CRD v1 was just to start somewhere and then improve on it, and we're trying to just iterate and kind of get to where we want. And I don't think we have a hard definition of this is what we want. Ideally, the Coke and Pepsi scenario is ideal, but I doubt that that's going to be something that this working group can do without help from API machinery and other SIGs.
I don't think you can ever have like two versions of the same CRD for two tenants in the same cluster without a lot of work.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's
In fact, this is Nick Hale from Red Hat on OLM. It's like one of the crux of the problems, especially since CRD API is iterating so quickly, and you have things like conversion webhooks now that need to be shared by multiple versions. And so now which controller or which API server now services that? Do you have to create a proxy to connect to the correct one? These are all like critical issues with that. So like API isolation at the namespace level would be really amazing, but as you mentioned before, all the issues with API machinery and other SIGs.
I think if we could start moving.
Is there any effort currently on making a namespace CRD?
So, I mean, we've discussed kind of when V1 came out of, it'd be, or at least, proposed that a tenant namespace, so we have the Tenancy CRD that we did for V1, and so tenant namespace would be kind of a mapping of.
Sorry, I was a little confusing with that statement. Let me try again. The topic that we were talking about a little bit was custom resource definitions are cluster wide. Is there any effort currently ongoing to create a namespace cluster resource definition?
I see. I'm not aware of any. I don't know if that falls in the purview of our working group or not. But I mean, I talked to some of the API machinery people at Barcelona a lot about our working group and what we're trying to accomplish. And there didn't seem to be a whole lot of current work. They've discussed it and they've talked about it, and it's a future thing. But I don't think it's a priority, I guess, is my understanding.
Yeah, I kind of agree that it's kind of out of scope of the project, the work group, but it's also beneficial to the work group. Is that something like we can report to the sister work groups that, hey, we need these things, or we would benefit from these things so that they can prioritize them?
I think we'd have to make a pretty strong case for them, because that's going to be very invasive change.
Right, and that's been a lot of the kind of the mindset from a lot of the people I've talked to, especially in API machinery. It's a lot of really deep changes to handle some of this stuff, and then just not convinced that it's worth the reward, because the use cases for them don't need it. So yeah, I think we just need to make the use case, or chip in and open some PRs and kind of start working towards that.
Or maybe that needs to be its own work group just for that topic.
Would you have use for that, immediate use for that, if it existed? Sorry, K Fox, I'm not sure who.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Maybe we're going a little bit off topic from Tenancy CRD V2.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I guess, more of open discussion. A lot of people were asking for V2 docs, so that's kind of why this is here. We don't, I mean, all of this is, I guess, beneficial to the group. So,
if I could make maybe
sorry, go ahead.
Just a related comment, like as I've been trying to get up to speed on this, I have some idea of some of the multi-tenancy use cases. There is a doc that we've been collecting with the critical user journeys and use cases, but to me, they were all pretty abstract. They didn't have a lot of, well, this organization wants this customer wants that. I wonder if that might be useful. Like Ryan, like what you just said, like we're Cray, we're on bare metal, we can't spin up additional clusters for our clients, and so that's why we want this kind of multi-tenancy. Like that's a lot of really valuable color that I find has been missing from the docs that I've been reading, and so maybe a few really specific ones. I've actually started my own just working doc of things that I've been able to find from past recordings of these meetings or from talks at KubeCon, like the Collide talk and stuff like that. And at some point I'd be willing to share that. But would that be interesting to anybody else, or do most people
yeah, that sounds really good. Should we just put that in this V2 document that we're starting?
Yeah, and I think that there's actually, at one point, there was a, Tasha had put together a list of kind of the use cases, but I think that those are the ones you were probably referring to, Adrian.
I think so, yeah. Somebody asked about them on Slack.
Yeah,
recently.
and is Cooper here? Because I think he had a lot of good stuff with that. He might not have made it. Anyway, so yeah, so I think, yeah, we could put those there of what use cases we want. Sorry, I lost my screen. And what people, I guess, are hoping to get out of this. And I guess too, I assume part of the V2 design discussions, people chipping in here have kind of looked at and seen in the V1 docs and the demo and stuff that you see and Sanjeev have done. Sanjeev did a few of them at Barcelona that are out on YouTube as well that it might be helpful to look at. So I guess from here, that's kind of what we're trying to discuss of what are the next steps we want to take with V2, what didn't we like with V1, and how can we start doing this without starting those kind of core changes to allow for namespace CRDs or cluster role bindings. I mean, CNIs, everything. Storage is the other one that comes up a lot. Is how do you have different storage classes for different tenants, etc. So let's do. And then feel free to just fill in. And then I guess, Tom, you have already kind of started on your open source one. Did you have anything you wanted to kind of add to any of this? Some of the things, now that you've seen RV1 and you've started kind of your own, I guess, what did you like or didn't like with our V1 versus what you're kind of going down?
Yeah, I almost like a lot of the API server implementations better that can limit the response objects and filter those out so the tenant looks like they have their own environment. That, from a tenant usability perspective, seems a little bit cleaner. But implementation-wise, that's a little bit more complicated, so there's a trade-off there. I think we're kind of all on the same page about, people want to be able to control default namespaces, i.e. what objects get created in every namespace for a tenant, and then also what cluster objects or tenant objects get created once for that tenant and then persist through the life cycle of that tenant and then get cleaned up once they're, I don't want to use the word evicted, but once they leave the cluster. So for cluster scope objects, back in the OpenShift tenant that we built, cluster resource quotas were right there and ready to be used to manage the resources of these tenants. So having this cluster scoped creation was ideal. I think there'll be some other use cases for that. Maybe, again, they have a storage on a PV that they want to be able to leverage, so they can make a PV with their NFS storage kind of like spec'd out there, and then they can consume that. But I'm trying to think about the right way to capture requests for what happens in each namespace and what happens at the tenant level. And I think those are the two challenges about usability, both from the tenant perspective and the cluster admin perspective, about what's allowed in each of those cases. And for the most part, the namespace scoped objects are kind of irrelevant. They don't really have an implication on the long term, on the overall cluster. But how those cluster scoped objects get created and modified, I think will be the responsibility of the cluster admin doing that. And I don't know if the right way is these request objects that go in there. I'm not a huge fan of the request objects that need to be.
What's a request object?
In the design doc for. I think Ryan has it up there on one of those tabs, the second tab. There was this idea of a namespace request that would then get approved by a cluster admin.
Yeah,
I just didn't like that process flow.
Yeah, I don't think many people did, and I think even they themselves said this is not a great idea, but it's a potential solution.
Right.
But yeah,
it's prescriptive.
So that kind of matches a little bit the tenant namespace thing, where they can put in a request for namespace. That's interesting too, in that you can have a policy or something that says just automatically do them, or you need an approver to have those approved.
Right. So the way I was doing is with role bindings, sort of, and an admission webhook to allow or not allow a certain person to create a tenant namespace or not, based on their membership of the group specified inside of Kubernetes. Now that's not done yet, but that's kind of the branch I'm working on in the repo that's linked in the notes.
Did you look at using Gatekeeper for that out of interest?
No, I don't know about Gatekeeper.
Okay.
Is that the new OPA thing?
Yeah, that's the OPA thing. Open Policy Agent Gatekeeper.
Yeah, I needed a Kubernetes connection string to be able to query to see if that user was a member of a group or not. So I looked at OPA briefly, but then I was like, well, I need to get a Kubernetes config. I need a...
Yeah, Gatekeeper is a bridge.
The home chart for OPA has an example, I think. I wrote it, that you can do SAR requests back to Kubernetes. So you can find out some of that stuff.
Ah, cool. All right.
Yeah, and Gatekeeper is a new alternative bridge between OPA and Kubernetes, where basically everything's in CRDs.
Yeah, is it relatively stable yet? Because I know that they were still pretty unstable in Barcelona.
They are aiming for beta by the end of this year, if my memory is correct.
Cool.
I've been peripherally involved in that project. I've been trying to get some the ability to do mutations in there, but that's not. I wouldn't count on that being there anytime soon.
So internally we've been looking at Gatekeeper, but we've been kind of waiting for it to stabilize a bit, just because alpha in production.
Yep, I think it's coming.
Yeah. So that's and that's kind of another, I guess, good point to bring up is we've kind of not, we haven't put a hard line that we have to use Kubernetes native things. We've kind of said that you can implement, and part of this, I guess, working group too, is this is how you can implement a tenant yourself. We can provide some CRDs, but then we could say you need to bring your own kind of authorization aspect to it, be it OPA or something else that meets these specs, etc. And so, because we don't want to say you have to use OPA or you have to use this, because then that doesn't really help anyone if they can't use that for whatever reason. So, and that's, I guess, another kind of issue with the working group in general is it's a very broad thing that we're trying to solve here. So if people have ideas around that, Gatekeeper specifically, and what it can help do, and where it would be beneficial to use it there, or just regular old RBAC, where the advantages, pros and cons, etc. Because I think for V2 we want to get much more closer to an actual usable solution. V1 is more of just here's a proof of concept, but you can't really use it in production. So yeah. So I guess open questions, or I guess tasks we can make that we'll use.
Just so you know, I do have the ability to work on this as my probably primary development task for the next little while.
Awesome. Okay, so I guess we need basically a spike. And then, I'm sorry, Tom, what did you say that you were using for, you're just using just normal admission hooks with basically some sort of RBAC to determine instead of the request method?
Yeah, I was debating this idea of a tenant RBAC, tenant role binding, which was either going to put default role bindings in each project namespace, or allow for who can provision tenants or not. Tenant namespaces, sorry. Well, this goes to, maybe it was your comment about now you're just re-implementing RBAC.
Right. I know that's kind of. Yeah. But at the same time, if we can leave the RBAC constructs to RBAC and just facilitate the templating and copying down that Adrian was mentioning, it can give us kind of what we need without having to do a lot of re-implementation, I would think.
Yeah.
Are there any existing controllers, like on Slack I mentioned, I think namespace configurator, I think it was called something like that. Are there any well-known or widely used templating engines on the server, as opposed to say customize, which is on the client?
I've worked with kudo.dev. I'm a contributor there. They do cluster side rendering.
Kudo.dev?
Kudo.dev is the website. It's more for app deployments, though. But it has the ability to render Kubernetes objects on the server.
Mm-hmm.
I think the closest that you would get kind of to that on the server side would be just an operator, right, with a CRD that can take any old YAML and template it in how it's needed.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering if there's a general purpose one.
I mean, I'm not aware of any that are
Okay.
kind of a general purpose. It's more been focused on certain, I guess, use cases in my experience.
Yeah, I wonder I guess the only thing, as I said at the beginning, I want to be a little bit wary about building in a templating solution into the tenant operator or tenant controller, whatever we want to call it. If we can make use of something else, that would be awesome, or even write it ourselves. Like I think one outcome of this might be, hey, we write 3 separate controllers and install these together, and that's our recommended flow. But if you want to just use one of them, that's fine too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally a big fan of that in general. Other, I guess, tasks that we need, I guess, from that's what I was thinking of too, as well, as either the Ansible or the Helm backend for the operator SDK. Any other spikes that we need for like a V2 design of, how, because I don't think we need to have a hard design here. This is just what do we want to build for V2, and then, well, let's actually build it. So we know for a fact that we don't like the requests, right? The request idea.
Yeah, that's kind of like merging the workflow in with the data.
Yeah, there's a reason there are storage providers, so cluster admins don't have to go build PVs for people.
Exactly, right. I mean, you don't want to have human interaction required. So I guess, have we decided that we need a concept of a tenant namespace, or a namespace that is tied to a tenant instead of just a tenant owning a bunch of namespaces?
What exactly is a tenant namespace in this context?
So the way I think about it, it's really kind of like, I don't know, we use Istio, so I think of it, the tenant namespace, as the virtual service that maps a gateway to an actual service. If you're familiar with Istio. If not, that's
Istio, yeah, okay, yeah.
But, just more of a mapping of, so you can create a new tenant namespace that maps to a tenant. And if you delete that tenant namespace, then the namespace goes away, but you don't have to edit the tenant at all, I guess.
So I think if we could have some control over namespace, where namespace actually had the concept of a tenant, then we could reuse the namespace object. But we really don't. We need to generate namespaces with stuff like tenant name / the namespace name that the user chose. So having a separate object that we can do RBAC with and manage by itself, I think, is going to make things a lot easier.
Yeah, I agree. Because I know the V1 approach to kind of, it injected a tenant ID in front of it, which to me, I think is a huge potential issue, because then people are going to be too tempted to do like regex on namespace name, and then there's security issues with that, because we can't prevent people from choosing any old namespace name. So.
So sorry, the tenant namespace would be a magical namespace identified with an annotation or a label or something like that?
I think it's more of really just some a CRD metadata that when a tenant namespace is created, it creates a namespace object with any RBAC that's defined by the tenant. So it's basically, that's how I
tenant namespace is not itself a namespace. It is a custom resource.
Correct. That's what I'm thinking, at least. I don't know what others have.
I'm kind of thinking both. To register a tenant namespace, you need some place to register that object. If there was a namespace for the tenant, that would give a logical place to put RBAC rules on it and to have those tenant namespace objects exist in, rather than being cluster wide, they could be per tenant.
So basically there's the chicken and the egg, right? So you need a namespace, and then you deploy your tenant CRD. And then from there, in that tenant namespace, and then in that same tenant namespace, or that namespace for the tenant, you create your tenant namespace CRDs that generate sub namespaces that are created and then inherit from the parent. Correct? Is that what
essentially. So like the cluster admin would create a tenant for user Joe or tenant Joe, and it would go create a namespace for that tenant where they could register as many tenant namespace objects as they wanted, and then each of those would go launch a namespace particular to that request.
How does the inheritance work in that case? I assume you want some kind of policy inheritance.
Not entirely sure. You'd have enough information that you could tailor the policy to the particular tenant and namespace.
I guess what I'm saying is, so I've got a tenant called Division, like Division A, and then inside Division A, I create, Group 1 and Group 2, and then inside Group 1 and Group 2, I create Team 1 and Team 2. If I'm an admin on Division A, do I have those same privileges in all of those other namespaces that got created?
No, I think you'd have an RBAC policy in the tenant namespace for
which tenant namespace?
That tenant.
Which tenant namespace?
The namespace for the tenant or the tenant namespace?
Yeah.
So the parent namespace will have RBAC for. So we've been running on like 3 different personas, which might be helpful to, I guess, to rehash. The first being the cluster admin, and they basically, they are the admins of the whole cluster, so they kind of have RBAC for everything, and they're the ones that can create cluster-wide resources, etc. And then there's the tenant admin, and they are the people that created or have been given access to administrate the tenant, and so they can create new tenant namespaces, and they can adjust the RBAC for that tenant, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's tenant users, and the tenant users exist within a tenant, either one or more namespaces, but they don't have any ability to, I guess, alter the tenant. So that's kind of what we're working with.
So there are multiple tenant namespaces per tenant is what we're saying.
I think that makes. I mean, that's kind of the general goal, right? Is we want to, a lot. So one of the biggest use cases that we hear is really just for a lot of people want from a dev perspective is they want to have developers want to deploy either a subset or all of the type of production, but they don't want to be tied to one namespace because in production they run in multiple namespaces.
Exactly.
And so that's kind of what the concept of what we've been going with.
Is tenant in this case? Are we usually talking about? A tenant is usually like a team of developers in most of our cases. Is that correct? Or developers and operators?
I think that's quite common. Our use cases are a little different than that, but yeah.
That might be
but
a
it could
useful
be
one to
VNF, right? Like the telecom containerized network functions, CNF.
Sorry, I missed that.
It could be like the tenants could be like containerized network functions, in telecommunication. That's also a possibility, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't really know enough about that, I guess, specific use case to say otherwise, but.
It's a typical telco use case, and you can see it as a collection of applications that provide a set of network functions, and you want them segregated from other such type that are running on the same cluster.
Sure. Yeah, that's exactly right.
And this tenant namespace will be the outermost boundary for the tenants, right?
No, it's the inner boundaries. There are many tenant namespaces per tenant. Is that correct, Ryan?
I think that's I guess the premise that we've been working with, but none of this is hard and fast to find. So,
Right.
yeah.
A
Okay,
question on the task here. There was that issue that you haven't touched upon, which is if you have a tenant that has multiple namespaces, but what about when those tenants or users of the tenants want to create their own CRDs? And CRD is a cluster-wide resource.
Right. So,
are you going to have a proposed solution for this as part of V2 or some approach?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean that's it's kind of out of our purview. Basically, so that the persona that we have, right, is that would be a cluster admin task because they have the ability to create cluster-wide resources. And so yeah, that's so nothing that we're creating for V2 can be any resemblance of like a hard multi-tenancy with a Coke and Pepsi, because there still needs to be a single admin of the cluster that is, facilitating that. And yeah, you can't have two different versions of the CRDs kind of out there because of that reason. And there is some work involved from the cluster admin to ensure that the different tenants aren't stepping on each other's toes from that perspective. And it's same with even just resource management and resource quotas. That it has to be per namespace right now for the most part. So that's kind of a cluster admin type task as well, to ensure that the tenant itself is using the resources that it's allocated.
I feel like if the work we're doing here were to succeed, like beyond my wildest dreams, you would get so many people using this stuff for multi-tenancy who are not even beginning to use it now, that it would generate that demand to take other things that are currently cluster scoped and move them to be namespace scoped.
Yep, that's exactly right. And that's really the big piece of this too, is we need more people kind of advocating for some of these features. Because as I mentioned, right, it doesn't, right now, a lot of people in the community don't think that the work necessitates the reward, because there's not been a whole lot of people asking for it, or at least not been vocal enough about it. So that's the goal, is if we can get something and get people started using it and iterate on it, and we can start to get some of those core features implemented to help with this.
How about things like CNI level segregation, right? Like we've been playing with having Calico have different pools, in example, and allocate the pools to different namespaces so that tenant A gets allocated from pool X and tenant B from pool Y and so forth. Is that of any interest to anybody else, or you guys don't care about that?
I think there's a ton of interest. It might be out of scope for this exact design.
I almost feel like you want a more Kubernetes approach for like.
Yeah, so in the in GitHub there's a document that Tasha had created. I think it's a PR right now. But we kind of outlined some of the things of some features that some features or implementations that we expect people to have for this. And so I guess the answer to your question is, we would say if you need this type of network segregation, or if that's something that you use case, here are some examples, or this is how we would recommend configuring it. But we don't want to advocate or dictate a very strict, this is what a tenant is and you have to do this, because if you don't fit into that, then you walk away and we can't improve. So.
But on the flip side of that, let's say that we define this tenancy primitive. It would be relatively simple then to build a controller that builds on that implements whatever detailed network policy you wanted. Or at least that's my assumption. Is that a fair assumption, or is that?
And that would be along the lines of what I was thinking, right? That you don't want to impose on people, but you want to be able to expose something in that tenant object that allows you to provide or make the decision, right? To provide some metadata or something that is useful for implementing a decision or fork options.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing that we're doing here. Like over and above any one feature is we're defining this new concept of tenant, or in my ideal world, I suppose, an extension of namespaces, which you can use to implement a tenant. Because once you have that concept, then you can hang as many different features off of it as you want, like pre-populated namespaces or some kind of like tenant-wide resource quota that spans more than one namespace.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I've advocated for, and not a lot of people agree with me, but I think of a tenant more so as if you just think of like a POSIX folder, it's nothing more than kind of a construct that you can put permissions around, and then the namespaces are the files within it. That's to me the ideal, and then we can add stuff to it. I'd prefer tenants to be pretty lightweight in that regard, but it's kind of hard to shim that in when there's no concept of it in the core, right?
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, so I mean, we have about 5 or so minutes left. We haven't really we've come up with a few tasks to look at, but nothing to actually get started. From an implementation perspective, do we want to kind of just recap? Does anyone have specific things that they want to start working on? I know Adrian, you were gonna look at USWI's code and see what we can, what if anything we could pull in from there.
Yeah, I am getting geared up to work. I don't know how much I'll be able to get done between this week and next. I think that, so sorry, what are we looking for? We're looking for development work, or we're looking for design work? Or what?
Well, so yeah, I think we want to nail down in design, and kind of, so we need to kind of see what of V1 we want to carry over, and what from V2 we want to change, and I guess really just kind of make any sort of progress, even if it's just creating some issues for implementation work that's required. We have a good jumping off point from V1, so I don't think we need a whole lot from there. But
is there a foundational step that means reviewing what you have in V1 in terms of the CRDs for tenant and tenant namespace, or you're happy with what you have and you don't think there's any real room for improvement there? The simple definition I'm talking about.
Yeah, so tenant namespace was not a part of V1. That was one of the kind of the suggestions that we had, and more than a few people have kind of brought up this as well. So tenant namespace is kind of a new concept. The tenant CRD, because it doesn't have tenant namespace, has a lot of stuff shimmed into it to kind of control the entirety of the tenant. So we're definitely going to need some changes with the tenant CRD and the tenant namespace. So some of the design work that's needed is to see what fits where and how that will work, and then start defining the controllers for both of those CRDs. And then I think it was K Fox had mentioned a parent namespace where these CRDs are deployed, and kind of controlled from an RBAC perspective, etc.
What's in a tenant that is not a tenant namespace, other than the tenant namespaces themselves?
About who should control provisioning of tenant namespaces, maybe default objects inside there. So if you have other RBAC you want to instill by default.
So defaults, okay.
Yeah.
And the idea is that each tenant might be very different. Like they might or might not have the same set of namespaces.
Right. We also put our resource quotas in the tenant object as well,
right,
for resource objects. Yeah.
Yep.
And so right now, the tenant resource objects apply per namespace. So it's basically what you want each namespace to have. It would be nice if we came up with a solution to aggregate all of that up into a tenant-wide resource quota. But
yep.
And I think most of that code is somewhat available from Red Hat in terms of cluster resource quotas. I think that functionality is the same, just instead of looking at aggregation by labels on namespaces, we look at the tenant ownership of the namespace and however that's identified.
Right.
So Red Hat, we'd like that. But I think this goes to the extensibility that you guys are talking about. That's an example where maybe the tenant resource quota is an additional operator. I think it would be great to have some sort of logging switch in your tenant so that you could specify a Splunk index that you need to do, that you need to send logs to. And maybe that's just an annotation or a label, but have some sort of ability to hook into what sidecar do I send this to? Or from FluentD, look up the tenant that's the index from the tenant in the log and send it to the appropriate index. So things like that, I think the extensibility would be, as I think Adrian was mentioning, that's what we want. We want this core thing that people can put their hooks onto and use cleanly.
Agreed, 100%.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Okay. So a couple of minutes left. We have some tasks we need to lock down and design. So I think after this, you know, we'll keep adding to this and we'll kind of clean it up and make it into an actual proposal. And then we'll start creating some GitHub tasks to start knocking these down, and we'll open it up for the for people to request. Just note that if you do want to be assigned some GitHub tasks, you'll have to open a PR to join SIG organization and put yourself as a member of the working group. That will give you permissions to, so then we can actually assign you tasks, and then you can open branches in our repos, et cetera, et cetera. So,
okay, sounds good.
Yeah, I mean, I could post a link to that as well. But yeah, anything else that people want to discuss before we go? We have a minute left. I think we've discussed a lot, and we have a decent idea of what we want. It's just we don't necessarily know what we can realistically do in a VP perspective.
Nothing from my end.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm gonna stop the meeting then, I guess. You guys have 60
Thanks
seconds.
for hosting.
Of course.
Yes, thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.